All right. So much like in our last video lecture that we were talking about um, the Sumerians, and we were talking about farming and what they needed to sustain life and what fertile meant, and we copied down the map of Mesopotamia. We're going to be working on page 5, which goes a lot with our reading that we did last week as well. So last week we learned that the land between Mesopotamia had rich soil compared to the areas around it. The rivers and fertile soil created an environment that was able to sustain life and civilization. We learned that it was the land between the two rivers because it's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Sumerians developed the earliest civilization around there around 3000 BC. Okay. And again, it was between those lovely two rivers. So today we're working on page 5, which our first question in our interactive notebook on page 5 says, the invention of the wheel. How did that change society? Click on our lovely little wheel here. The invention of the wheel took time to perfect. It was used for irrigation, milling, pottery making. Now it's used for almost all forms of transportation and machinery. It's one of the most greatest achievements of mankind, right? We have wheels on our vehicles. We have wheels on chairs. We have wheels on countless things, right? So underneath the flap that says the invention of the wheel on page 5, how did that change society? This is what you're going to pause the video and write down underneath that flap. All right. Our next flap, what was the Sumerians' economy like? Right? The economy was based on farming. Trade and industry became important during this time, right? Because if they had a surplus of something, if they had something extra, they could go and trade it for other things. They had farming in order to grow enough food for all the people in the society, right? So underneath the flap, what was Sumerians' economy like? You're going to pause this video and go ahead and write that information down. Our third flap, which is our second bubble, what supplies did the Sumerians have? They had stone, they had wood, they had mud, clay, reeds, rivers, soils, crops. Okay? They had tons, well, they didn't have tons of supplies, but they had the supplies they needed in order to sustain their life. Okay? So that's your third flap, and you're going to pause this video to go ahead and write this information down underneath that flap on page 5. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about ziggurats. And week 2, we watched some videos on Khan Academy that talked about them and their importance. They were the most prominent buildings in the cities, ziggurats were. Okay. So this is again on page 5. It's that very large flap where you have a picture of a ziggurat. Okay. So underneath this flap, you're going to write this information down. The Sumerians believed that the gods and goddesses were in charge of the cities. Sumerians worshipped them and devoted their wealth to the ziggurat temples. The buildings were at the center of the city-states. Okay, so they were a place where Sumerians could go and worship their gods and goddesses. They kind of acted like a shrine, okay, because they believed that the gods and goddesses were responsible for everything that happened. They were responsible for the sun coming up, the sun going down. They were responsible for the fact that they had food, that they were able to farm, that they could invent things. Okay, so they Sumerians worshipped those gods and goddesses, and they devoted all of their wealth to these temples. They built these temples in order to worship those gods and goddesses. So you'll pause this video and go ahead and write that information down. Okay. Again, those were the most prominent buildings in the cities. Ziggurats were. All right. So that concludes our very short second lecture, it really just goes back to the reading that we did last week. So if you want a refresher on that reading, you can go ahead and re-listen to that chapter that we read together in order to do that. And that's located on YouTube. You can go back to the last hyperdoc as well to get to that video. But that concludes our second lecture.